Thanks, Ciarán. Minister, really this scandal over Apple's tax affairs and, as we have stressed in our motion, the tax affairs of other multinationals, a small, select group of multinationals in this country, reveals the true schism, if you like, in Irish politics, and we've seen it witnessed today in the Dáil, with Fine Gael, Fianna Fail and Labour closing ranks to protect the interests of one of the wealthiest multinationals in the world that is engaged in massive tax evasion and was using this country as a base for that tax evasion, and in the process robbing the citizens of this country of billions in revenue that they desperately need to resolve a housing and homelessness emergency, a dire crisis in our health service, an incredible deficit in the investment in vital infrastructure, whether it's water, schools or other vital infrastructure, money that could create tens of thousands of well-paid jobs for people that need them. But you guys, the establishment, band together, continue the cover-up, say no to this money to protect the tax-dodging activities of Apple and, as we suggest, other multinationals who also availed of these tax scams that you have worked to establish and to protect. And I don't believe have any intention of truly phasing out. And the scale of the cover-up and the hypocrisy that I'm listening to in here is really quite extraordinary. I was on the Finance Committee in 2013 when it wasn't very popular, as we're often accused of being populist. It wasn't popular to go against the consensus that we must not dare talk about our corporation tax rate. In fact, the reality is it lost us votes because we had the courage to say something was wrong with our corporate tax system and to campaign on that basis. And as a result, forced a sort of examination of the corporation tax system in the Finance Committee, with a subcommittee being set up to do that. But the first item on the agenda was the establishment closing ranks to make sure we didn't get to the bottom of the scandal that has now exploded. Because I put down a motion asking that Apple, Google, Facebook and others would be brought into that committee to answer questions the same way as they had been in the US Senate and in the British Parliament, and Fianna Fail, Fine Gael, Labour and some independents closed ranks and voted down that motion. But not only did they do that, and this fact hasn't come out, before that motion was put on a committee chaired by a member of the Labour Party, a motion was put down to hold that debate in camera, to switch off the cameras, so the public did not get to see even the fact that we were debating the possibility of bringing Apple, Google and Facebook in to answer questions. How much of a cover-up is that? Absolutely extraordinary. And precisely, we were saying to the Labour Party, who now incredibly say they are converted to the idea of an effective tax rate, but weren't in favour of it when we were pushing it for the last 5 years, in fact dismissed it as fantasy economics, an imaginary pot of gold that didn't exist. But it did exist, it does exist, and Europe has now exposed what we have been saying as true. You've been caught out. That is the fact of the matter. But you continue with the obfuscation, the lies, the myths, in order to throw people off the scent. First of all, claiming we couldn't spend the 13 billion. Quickly shot down by the EU, we could spend it. It would fundamentally transform the lives of huge numbers of our citizens, particularly the most vulnerable ones. Claiming then it would endanger foreign direct investment and all the multinationals would run out. Nonsense. Quickly nailed by Tim Cook, because it is not the case that these guys can just run away, or would run away, from the billions of profits they are making, because even if they had to pay the 12.5% rate, they would be paying far less in reality, than they would pay in most jurisdictions across Europe. But that's not good enough for them. They want to pay virtually nothing, and we facilitated that. The myth that we have closed down the loopholes and that this is a legacy issue. Sorry, we haven't. Again, something that we cried foul about. The double Irish is not gone. It is still available to Apple, Google and Facebook now, because it is still in existence to 2020. And we don't know, and we can't get the figures from revenue to find out, is the double Irish still being operated? But if it is, there is a decision about how are we going to calculate Apple's tax this year, and next year, and the year after, and the year after that. And the answer to that question is about 1 or 2 billion or more euro a year. Revenues available not from the past, but in the future, now, which would make a huge difference to our budget. And to our capacity to invest in things like housing and alleviate the suffering and hardship that so many of our citizens are suffering. But I want to go to the question of the integrity of our tax system, because this is really the laughable suggestion, that we must lodge the appeal in order to defend the integrity of our tax system. First of all, the first of these tax rulings was in 1991, the era of Ansbacher and of Charlie Haughey. The Ansbacher accounts where the Irish rich have been siphoning off money that was actually onshore but supposedly offshore since 1971. Since 1971, and it was only as a result of political pressure and outrage and an expose, not by revenue, but from outside, that forced the McCracken Tribunal. And it was only in 1999 that Revenue finally decided to start investigating the matter and starting to uncover the funds. So is our tax system covered in glory, that we would not question its integrity? Well, I'm afraid not. But then we move on to the tax ruling of 2007. And this is really what I want to get to, because you see, one of the things that was produced in that committee that we weren't allowed to ask the questions of Apple and Facebook, because you guys turned off the cameras and voted down the proposal, but there was a paper produced by the Department of Finance, authored by Seamus Coffey, which showed some of the figures. And nobody bothered to read these things, as is so often the case, but the truth is in the figures. I refer any of our economics or political correspondence to page 27 and 28 of the Department of Finance paper on the effective corporate tax rates in this country. And what it shows is something quite incredible. The average amount of what are called deductions, that, in other words, are things, parts of company profits that can be written off from their tax liability as costs to that company or companies, those deductions jumped from about an average of €2 billion a year in 2004-05 to €21 billion a year in 2011. And God knows what it was after that, because we don't have the figures and can't get figures from revenue until 4 or 5 years after the fact. Another scandal. So, the amount that these companies could write off jumped in a period of 4 or 5 years, €19 billion. €19 billion that was not taxed at the 12.5% rate. The biggest jump in that write-off came after the 2007 ruling, where it jumped from 6 billion to 19 billion and then up to 21 billion within a year or two. And as I said, it may well have gone up much higher than that after. We don't have the figures, but we need to see them. So the taxable income drops from 2007, this is for total taxable income in the whole corporate sector, drops from 56 billion in 2007 to 37 billion. 20 billion less in taxable income, which is almost exactly the same as the figure in deductions allowed, 19 billion. And the paper helpfully explains that this can be explained by patent royalties paid by certain multinationals to their subsidiaries. So what the ruling allowed them to do was write their own tax bill. That's what it did, and give them absolute certainty that they will be able to write their own tax bill indefinitely. And then use colluded to cover that up until now. And helpfully in this paper, which is also part of the cover-up that you distributed last night, but it does tell us a few things. In 1991, a basis proposed by Apple for determining Apple Computers' accessories, then ASI's branch, net profit was agreed by Revenue. So Apple go to Revenue and say, we've got a proposal as to how you calculate our profits. And then they do it again in 2007. Now, does any other taxpayer get that opportunity? To go in and say to Revenue, we'll tell you how to calculate our tax bill. No, I don't think so. No, this is the government who will deduct unjust property taxes out of people's wages if you don't pay. This is the government that will send the police out against anti-water protesters because they are unable or unwilling to pay unjust water charges. These are the people who inflict brutal austerity imposed by the Troika to pay off the bank debts, the gambling debts of banks and financial speculators, regardless of the hardship and suffering that is imposed on ordinary people. But when it comes to Apple and Google and Facebook, we protect them and they can make their own tax arrangements. That's what happened. No arm's length principle, no equality, no tax justice. They tell Revenue how to calculate their tax, and Revenue does it. Now, please do not tell me that when the allowable deductions from income, from profits, jump by about 18 to 19 billion in 2 or 3 years, that you guys didn't notice, that Revenue didn't notice, that you didn't know that this profit was being shifted to companies that had a tax residency nowhere in the world. You didn't know that? Come off it. Everybody knew it. Everybody knew it, that they were involved in massive tax evasion. But we simply chose to turn a blind eye, to put in place the mechanisms that allowed them to do it. And then resist the calls to close down that loophole, which you now claim you have closed down, but I repeat, you give a sunset clause, which means that the same companies, no other company, can avail of the double Irish, but the same companies can continue to avail of it till 2020, and in the meantime, you develop a patent box that will allow them to do exactly the same thing in a different way, which will be able to write off the cost of new innovations, developing new patents, and all profits generated from those things. That's the very important thing. All profits generated from any new upgrade of an Apple phone or of an Apple computer, all profits generated from that will be written off. That's what the patent box is proposing. So, we are saying no. And just the last point, the last 2 minutes I have, Apple is appealing anyway, so it doesn't make any difference, we won't be able to spend the money. How much weaker would Apple's case be to appeal this if the Irish government said we're accepting the ruling because it is true? Because in fact we did do something wrong. We did give a selective advantage to these corporations, which everybody knows is true, and I've just provided hard evidence which is in the Revenue's tables, which shows they had to have known. If they didn't know this, and if you didn't know this, you should be all flung out in your ear for this scale of profit shifting and not to notice it, but of course you noticed it. Now, if we put up our hands and say, yes, this was wrong, These companies, as everybody knows, were evading tax to the tune of billions of euros. Apple's case at the EU Commission would collapse. Maybe they'd pursue it, and maybe they wouldn't. But their case would be massively weakened if we did the honest thing and the fair thing from the point of view of our citizens. Finally, Ciarán, let me answer the point that we're just the critics and the exploiters of problems. In this motion, and consistently in every single budget, we have said what we believe is the alternative, and this proves that it wasn't a fantasy. Tax the wealth of the corporations and of the super wealthy who've been consistently protected, and use that money that we now actually have figures for, although it's the tip of the iceberg when you include the Facebooks and the Googles and the LinkedIns and all the rest of them. Use that money to invest in developing green jobs, developing our natural resources, which in fact the Taoiseach said we don't have many of, but we have a hell of a lot of. Use that money to build the social and affordable housing that we need. Use it to invest in our health service, to invest in our universities, to invest in the arts, which are starved of funding, and so on. We could create tens of thousands of jobs, which would not be based on facilitating these greedy multinationals, whose activities are robbing the European Union of €1 trillion a year. That is being robbed off the citizens, that are the single biggest contributory factor to global inequality, which is rising to obscene levels across the world. Now, that would be an honourable and honest and decent thing to do, but no, this government just wants to keep up the cover-up and waste more taxpayers' money fighting to defend the interests of the super tax-dodging elite in this country and across the world.
Thank you, Deputy. Now, Deputy McBarrett, you have 8.5 minutes remaining in the slot.
Well, last count, Comhairle, I am a Dáil deputy for the Cork North Central constituency. Apple's Irish operations are based in Hollyhill, in Cork North Central. It's a little over a mile away from where I live. Many of my constituents work on the Hollyhill campus. If you go around the doors in Cork North Central, you will see the Apple logo stuck on the glass of many of the porches in front